Hi, beautiful souls. It's Sadhana. I'm back for the final segment, or my final segment of 31 Days of Tarot 2019. And I have a few questions left to answer. And the next one is regarding how do I choose decks for readings? And that is a really good question. And sometimes it is easier than others. I try to have a variety of decks for different situations, for different ages of people, for people who are more experienced with the tarot, people who are for first readings and things like that. So regardless of whether I'm home where all my decks are here or whether I am um, out and about, I try to have a good range of I try to have a good variety of decks on hand. And one of the decks that I showed a few days ago when I was doing the unpacking my tarot box was the Spirit Within by Stephen Bright. I do readings for several young men, so late teens, early 20s, who are really interested in the tarot, interested in metaphysical, and I find that this deck speaks very well to them. So having the images and the scenes in silhouette allows for I don't know, it allows for the ease of storytelling, for the ease of flexibility with messages. And I just find that it also has more of a modern take. Some of the images are in the city, some of them are in the country, and I have no problem kind of going where I need to go with this deck. Its simplicity allows for variety and variation, and the colors are easy to read because the suits are color coded, and I never get stumped with where I am in the deck. You know, sometimes if I'm using a really artsy deck with and I'm not familiar with the artwork, and the either the deck is not marked with the numbers and the suits, or maybe they're really tiny or they're hard to read in a dark room and I don't have my glasses on. Sometimes I actually, get stumped between suits and decks when they have gone in a different direction. And that's not the case at all with this deck. So I find this um, a really good deck to have in my kit. For the most part, I find that when people are coming for readings, so if it's a spur of the moment reading, they often do not have a question prepared. And then we get into the reading and it's like, oh, and all of a sudden a question does come up. And for the most part, I think the questions that querents ask are, it's really hard stuff that people are going through. And that may be one of the reasons I have such a huge variety of more gentle and soft decks. For those of you that have been watching my channel, you know that Lily White is one of my current favorites, and I feel really comfortable using this with men and women, with all kinds of situations. I did a walkthrough of this deck. You can go back to my walkthroughs on my channel. And there are some challenging cards here. The knights in particular take a little while to get to know, but this deck works well with a whole range of people. So I have this one on hand. One of the, sometimes if there are several people in the room and they are all having a reading, I like to switch up the decks. So I will have 3 or 4 decks right beside me on my table, and I'll make sure that each person gets a different deck. And somehow, some way, it seems that it's always the perfect deck for the perfect person. I think it was my first deck. I have the Robin Wood deck, but the Osho Zen Tarot has been a deck that I've had for a long, long time. This one is trimmed, and I've trimmed off the keywords. This deck is another deck that works really well with all kinds of situations. And because I've been using it for so long, I'm really comfortable with using this deck. So that for sure is a deck that It's always at the bottom of my basket. I can use that easily for any number of readings. So right, it depends on the age, the mood, the question, and that kind of stuff. So if it was um, a love relationship, I'm going to pull a deck that is, it's going to help. And I know has really nice quirk cards and the people. There's a variety of ages and situations with people. If it's a work relationship, I'm going to pull a Pentacle strong deck. I'm going to, that, or maybe also the wands are really strong because we're going to be looking at action and things like that. So it really depends on the question. So one has to have a variety of decks for, a variety of situations. Let's go on because I could talk about that for a long time. The next question is about my go-to tarot book. I don't usually refer to tarot books other than if I'm studying a particular deck and I'm trying to, uncover and understand what's going on with that deck. The artwork is unfamiliar. Some of the cards have taken a different perspective, and then I'm going to look at the book that comes with the deck, and then I may go back to refer to another deck. But I will show you one of my all-time favorite tarot books. Here we go. So this is one of my all-time favorite tarot books by Isabel Kliegman, and the copyright on this book is 1997. This is an excellent book for studying the minors, and I refer to this book. I've read it many times. I have lots of markups in this book, and it does a great job with Tree of Life. So the Kabbalah, and also I think it talks about the chakras as well too. So it does a really good job in connecting different esoteric practices and just the journey of the minors. For each minor, there's about 4 pages. And she gives examples from her experience as a reader, and does a lot of teaching as well too. The first whole section of the book is about the Tree of Life. So I'll just read a little bit from the 9 of Pentacles just so you can get a flavor for how Isabel writes. The 9 of Pentacles holds the assurance to us that if we can truly accept and know ourselves well enough to discipline our passions, we are assured of serenity and abundance. Yesod is associated with the axis that runs from the base of the spine to the genitals. In the chakra system, this encompasses our most deeply rooted instincts, survival and procreation. How safe do we feel in the world? How comfortable are we with our sexuality? Our most profound and least understood feelings are buried in these least conscious chakras, yet they constitute the foundation of the lives we manifest. The 9 of Pentacles, in fully accepting herself, magnetizes the abundance of which she feels worthy and is serene in solitude. So she writes really, really well. And I love it too when she gives personal examples. So that's Tarot and the Tree of Life by Isabel Kliegman. And then going on to the next question, it says, how do I feel about deck modifications? And do I draw on my decks, trim borders, and da-da-da-da-da? I've never done a deck modification video, and I may do one day. But I'll share with you a few of the reasons why I do deck modifications. I touched on this yesterday. So this is the Dreaming Way Tarot. This is a tarot that I had a very difficult time. I still have a difficult time associating with. In trimming the cards, it gives you time in a very kind of intentional way to look at each and every single card. And going through, doing the trimming, rounding the corners. It gives you time to spend time with the deck. And this deck I edged in green, and still, even after all that time, I need to do some more work with it. So that's one of the reasons that I do deck modifications. Another reason would be when the cards are just too big. So this is the Margaret Peterson Tarot, and I trimmed this because it was just, too difficult to shuffle. And it's a deck that I use all of the time. So I believe the numbers were on the top, so the numbers for the majors were cut off in the trimming, and I did not write. I have never written on a deck. So isn't that a beautiful card? That's the Ace of Air. God, I love this deck. And I did not edge this deck. I may do that one day. The other thing that you should know, if you have never done a deck modification, if you've never trimmed a deck, when you trim a deck, it's almost impossible to get it absolutely perfect and flush. And depending on the card stock, it will, it may or may not be possible to riffle shuffle after you trim the deck, because cutting the edges does something to the lamination, and depending on how sharp your scissors are, it's just different afterwards. So after I trim a deck, I find that it is a little more challenging to riffle shuffle and have to do an overhand shuffle. This is my trimmed Osho Zen, and I did the edge in multiple colors. So I actually color coded. It wasn't random, so I did suits, different suits, and the majors in different colors to match the back of the deck. Sometimes I just find that the white sides kind of really stick out. So here's the steampunk edged in brown. And the thing about edging is that if you trim a deck, you're going to need a lot more ink. Sometimes you have to go around twice, because in taking off the lamination and in cutting the edge, there's a lot of it gets absorbed into that paper. And of course, it's going to take a lot longer to dry. If you have not trimmed the edges, then it's going to take less ink. I edged a very large oracle deck not too long ago, and I will never do that again, because it just takes so much ink. The more cardboardy the deck, the more ink that you are going to require. So I would definitely advise against edging decks that have a very cardboardy kind of stock. I don't know if you can see, this is the Good Tarot that I edged in gold. And I noticed the other day that, from time to time you'll see cards and you'll see little bits that you missed. So I find it's really important in a tarot journal or somewhere to write down what ink you use. So if you want to go back and touch it up, you know which ink pad or which marker you were using for your deck modification. The very first deck that I trimmed was the Wheel of the Year Tarot, and I did it on a slide, like a paper cutter. Totally ruined it. And then I did it again with scissors, and it turned out just perfect. So I completely trimmed everything off. This is one of the low Scarabeo decks that has multiple languages. And so in trimming the whole deck, I also cut off all of the numbers and the titles. And I chose not to write on this deck because it's easy enough for me to know what is what. Even the court cards I found are easy enough to identify. So perhaps one day I will write on it, but I've never done that. There's your Queen of Air. She looks a lot like the scary queen in Snow White. So that's deck modifications. Here's another deck that I did. This is the Crystal Visions Tarot. Different colors on the edge, trimmed. And this was a deck that I did trim for multiple reasons. I do like this deck. It's not one I use a lot. It's a really pretty deck. Yeah, so that's my answer to deck modifications. When you trim a deck, it's really important to look at both the front and the back to see if it has been printed straight. This is the Pixie Lenormand Pixies Lenormand, and the cards were not printed straight. So I trimmed it from this side, so this side looks fine, but the backs were not, the paper was not, the cards were not printed straight on the paper, so you can see little bits of white on the edge. And if I fan the cards here, you can see that that is a problem for the whole deck. And that really kind of ruined the deck for me. I actually may repurchase the deck and see if that particular one was printed straight. And if it is, I may trim it again, or I may just keep it untrimmed. So really important to look at the front and the back before you trim, unless you're going to trim a lot off so that it doesn't matter if it's printed straight or not. That was a big mistake that I made, with that one, and I did it with another deck as well too. So the next question is about predictive tarot and whether I use tarot for divination. And I think the answer is sometimes yes and sometimes no. When I look at a reading, I do a lot of 9 cards. I do a lot of other larger spreads. I use Lenormand. And sometimes the cards on the right side of a reading tend to look like a path. They look like the natural steps, the consequences of what's happened in the past, and they make sense. They look like a road that is leading ahead. And if you do this, then it makes sense that the cards ahead are turning in a certain direction. It shows, the tarot can warn us. It can help us to see obstacles. It can help us to, to make better choices. At the same time, when I'm doing a reading, especially a face-to-face reading, I'm very careful with my words and say that this is the potential energy, and you always have the choice of free will. Sometimes in a reading, I will have, I will say, if you do this, if you take this step, then this is a potential outcome. If you do this, then that is a potential outcome. And I usually use those words, potential. I talk a lot about energy. Rarely will I ever say your future, this is in your future. I don't use that kind of language. So I guess, the bottom line is, if people are coming to me to have their fortunes told or their future told, one of the first things I'll say is, well, that's not how it works. And the last question for the 31 Days of Tarot is about questions that I ask for myself, and when I'm doing readings with others, what are the most frequently asked questions? For me, I try to help people see what they're missing, where to put their focus, where does their attention need to be at this time, what do they need to know to work through a current situation. So the tarot is very much, it's like a flashlight. It's shining focus on perhaps what you're missing, or, sometimes it can be more, of a kick in the pants, but it is meant to guide and to bring awareness to what you may not think is important at this time. And then if I'm doing a reading for myself, I do something very similar. I'm shuffling the cards and saying, what is it that I need to focus on today? What do I need to know about today? Where should my energy lie today? Those kind of questions. So that is a wrap for 31 Days of Tarot. Thank you for being here with me, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Stay well, my friends. Namaste.